My name is Dr. Helena Ruiz, and I used to believe that some things were meant to stay buried, that the earth holds secrets for good reason, and disturbing them only invites the kind of pain that reshapes your understanding of what's possible in a world that already contains too much suffering. I thought that when tragedy claims the innocent, when children disappear without trace and leave behind only questions that grow more painful with each passing year, the kindest thing is to let the silence have them, rather than keep digging through soil that holds nothing but heartbreak. I was wrong. Some secrets don't decay in darkness. They grow stronger, more determined, waiting for the right moment to claw their way back to the surface and demand acknowledgement from those who thought they could safely forget. The call came on a Tuesday morning that had already tested my resolve in ways I wasn't equipped to handle. I'd been awake since 3 a.m., pacing my apartment like a caged animal, replaying the nightmare that had been visiting me with increasing frequency over the past month. Always the same dream. Endless white corridors echoing with my sister Lucia's voice calling, "Helena, help me," while I searched door after door, finding only empty rooms and the lingering scent of fear. I'd wake with my hands clenched into fists so tight my nails left crescents in my palms, my heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape the cage of memory that held it captive. Coffee had become my anchor to the waking world, and I was nursing my 4th cup when the phone rang at 7:23 a.m. The voice belonged to Marcus Rodriguez, a city sanitation worker I'd helped before when he'd found injured animals during his rounds. His usual easy confidence was absent, replaced by something that sounded like bewilderment, mixed with the kind of unease that comes when the familiar world presents something that doesn't fit into known categories. "Doc Ruiz, I got something weird out here behind the old Meridian textile mill. There's a dog, been watching her for 3 days now. She's not dead, but she's not really living either. Dug herself into a hole so deep I almost missed her. Just these eyes staring up from the dirt like she's trying to disappear into the earth itself. The Meridian Mill." Even hearing the name sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the October wind rattling my windows. The abandoned textile factory had been empty for 15 years, ever since the company moved operations overseas and left behind a monument to economic decay. The building squatted on the edge of town like a broken tooth, surrounded by weeds and rumors and the kind of darkness that accumulated in forgotten places. Most people avoided it. Even the city had essentially written it off as too expensive to demolish, too damaged to renovate. But I knew why Marcus's call felt like a summons rather than a simple request for help. 3 years ago, I'd been part of a federal research team that had conducted experiments in the mill's basement, back when it was briefly repurposed as a cognitive research facility. The work had been classified, ethically questionable, and ultimately terminated when funding mysteriously disappeared and all records were sealed. I'd left that project with questions I couldn't ask and guilt I couldn't shake, trading my government clearance for a veterinary license and a promise to myself that I'd dedicate my life to healing instead of harming. The drive to the mill took 18 minutes through neighborhoods that grew progressively more desolate with each mile. When I pulled into the weed-choked parking lot, Marcus was waiting beside his truck, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by something I'd never seen in him before. Genuine fear. "She's around back," he said, leading me past rusted machinery and broken windows that gaped like empty eye sockets. "Doc, I've been doing this job for 12 years. Found everything from rabid raccoons to half-dead deer. But this is different. It's like she chose that spot specifically, like she's been waiting for someone to find her." The hole was exactly where he'd said it would be, tucked behind a pile of industrial debris and overgrown with kudzu that had been carefully pushed aside. It wasn't large, maybe 3 feet across and 2 feet deep, lined with scraps of tarp and rotting blankets that suggested it had been occupied for much longer than 3 days. But it was what emerged from that makeshift grave that stopped my breath in my throat. 2 amber eyes, bright with intelligence and infinite sadness, stared up at me from the darkness. The face that surrounded them was gaunt with starvation, covered in dirt and dried blood, but unmistakably canine. A medium-sized dog, probably a shepherd mix, with fur that might have been golden under all the grime and matted neglect. She didn't growl when I approached, didn't show any sign of aggression or even fear. She just watched me with those impossibly knowing eyes, as if she'd been expecting me specifically. "Hey there, beautiful," I whispered, kneeling at the edge of her refuge. "What are you doing down there?" She blinked once, slowly, but made no move to emerge from her burrow. When I extended my hand, she didn't flinch, but she didn't respond either. It was as if she existed in some space between the living and the dead, aware but disconnected, present but unreachable. I spent 2 hours in that abandoned lot, speaking in the gentle tones I'd learned during my veterinary training, offering water and food that she refused with polite disinterest. Marcus had long since returned to his route, leaving me alone with this enigmatic creature who seemed determined to disappear into the earth. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the broken skyline of the mill, I made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. I reached into the hole, slowly and carefully, sliding my arms around her fragile frame. She was lighter than she should have been, all bone and sinew wrapped in fur that felt like silk despite its matted condition. To my surprise, she didn't resist. She simply allowed herself to be lifted as if she'd been waiting for this moment of rescue or surrender. But when I pulled her into the fading daylight, what I saw around her neck left me breathless and trembling. Tied with careful precision around her throat was a child's shoelace, bright pink despite the dirt and wear, knotted with the clumsy earnestness that belonged to small fingers learning to tie bows. Attached to that makeshift collar was a small metal medallion, tarnished with age but still legible. Engraved in careful script were the words, "Anna, 4th grade." The world tilted sideways. I sat down hard on the broken asphalt, the dog still cradled in my arms, as memories I'd thought were safely buried came flooding back with devastating clarity. Ana Morales had been 9 years old when she disappeared, walking home from school with her golden retriever on a Tuesday afternoon that had seemed no different from any other. The search had consumed the town for months, involving federal agents and bloodhounds and psychics and volunteers who combed every inch of the surrounding forests and abandoned buildings. Anna and her dog had simply vanished, leaving behind nothing but questions and a grief that had settled over the community like ash from a distant fire. That had been 10 years ago, when I was still working for the government, still believing that the research we were conducting in facilities like the Meridian Mill would somehow make the world safer, better, more knowable. Now I was holding what might be the only surviving witness to whatever had happened to that little girl, and the weight of that possibility was crushing. "Oh, God," I whispered into the dog's matted fur. "What happened to you? What happened to Anna?" She turned her head and looked directly into my eyes, and for a moment I felt like I was drowning in that amber gaze. There was something ancient and knowing in her expression, something that spoke of secrets too terrible for words and love too strong for death. She leaned against me with a trust that felt both precious and undeserved, and I knew that our fates had become inextricably linked in that moment. The drive back to my clinic passed in a haze of tears and fragmented memories. I'd named her Echo before we'd even reached the main road, though I couldn't have explained why. The name felt right, appropriate for a being who seemed to exist between worlds, carrying messages from places the living weren't meant to visit. At the clinic, I worked in careful silence, documenting her injuries and malnutrition while she lay perfectly still on the examination table. She was severely underweight, dehydrated, bearing the scars of old wounds that spoke of violence and neglect. But it was the X-rays that revealed something that made my hands shake as I held the films up to the light. Running along her spine, embedded so carefully in her nervous system that it looked like it had grown there, was a thin metallic thread. Not surgical wire, not any kind of medical implant I'd ever encountered in veterinary practice. It was too precise, too sophisticated, and it connected to her brainstem in a way that suggested purpose rather than accident. I'd seen similar technology before, during my brief and regrettable career in government research. Neural monitoring devices, designed to record and transmit sensory data, to preserve memories and experiences that might otherwise be lost. The project had been canceled when ethical oversight committees raised questions about consent and human rights, but not before several prototypes had been developed and tested. Looking at those X-rays, I realized that Echo wasn't just a survivor of whatever had happened to Ana Morales. She was a witness, a living recording device who might hold the key to a mystery that had haunted our town for a decade. The thought both thrilled and terrified me. Over the following days, Echo began to show signs of behavior that reinforced my growing suspicions about her true nature. She would react to specific sounds with an intensity that suggested recognition rather than simple startle response. Music boxes made her cower in terror. Fire alarms triggered episodes where she would stand rigid, eyes unfocused, as if she were experiencing something invisible to the rest of us. But it was her response to recorded voices that convinced me I was dealing with something unprecedented. While reviewing old therapy dog training materials, I played a sample recording of a child's voice saying simple commands and encouragements. When the young girl's voice said, "Come home, girl. It's okay," Echo stood up from where she'd been lying listlessly in her kennel and walked to the speaker. She pressed her nose against the device and whimpered once. a sound so full of longing and loss that I had to leave the room to compose myself. That night, I dreamed of corridors again, but this time they weren't empty. The walls were covered with children's drawings, crayon masterpieces that depicted dogs with wings and houses made of sunshine and stick figures holding hands under rainbow skies. In the center of it all, drawn in careful block letters, was a message that made me wake up sobbing. She saved me. The next morning brought a visitor who confirmed my worst fears and my most desperate hopes. A woman appeared at my clinic just after opening, pale and quiet, with eyes that held the same ancient sadness I'd seen in Echo's gaze. She didn't give her name, didn't explain how she'd known to come. She simply stood outside Echo's kennel for nearly an hour, watching my patient with an expression that combined recognition with something that might have been relief. "They sent her back," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. But she wasn't alone down there. "Who sent her back?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. The woman smiled sadly, the kind of expression that carried decades of grief and hard-won wisdom. She remembers more than she should, more than they intended her to. That's why they let her go. Before I could ask more questions, she was gone, slipping out of the clinic like smoke, leaving me alone with Echo and a growing certainty that we were both in more danger than I'd realized. That evening, driven by a combination of scientific curiosity and desperate hope, I ran another scan of Echo's nervous system. The equipment glitched almost immediately, the screen flickering between normal imaging and displays I'd never seen before. But in the moments of clarity, I saw something that made my blood freeze. A file name, buried in the metadata of the scan, that I recognized from my government research days. Retention Trials, Phase 2. I'd worked on Phase 1 of that project before ethical concerns had supposedly shut it down. The goal had been to develop technology that could preserve and transfer memories, initially for treating trauma and cognitive disorders, but with obvious applications for intelligence gathering and surveillance. Phase 2 had been theoretical when I'd left the program, focused on creating living archives that could store and retrieve experiences independently of their original hosts. Looking at Echo, curled up in her kennel but watching me with those impossibly knowing eyes, I realized that Phase 2 hadn't been theoretical at all. It had been tested, perfected, and then hidden when the subjects proved too difficult to control. Echo wasn't just carrying Anna's memories, she was carrying Anna herself, in some form that transcended traditional understanding of consciousness and identity. I pulled her into my lap, feeling the warm weight of her body against mine, and whispered the question that had been burning in my chest since I'd first seen that pink shoelace around her neck. What did they do to you? What did they do to Anna? Echo looked up at me, not at my face, but somehow deeper, into places I'd thought were protected by skin and bone and willful ignorance. Then she did something she'd never done before. She barked. Once, sharp and clear, a sound that seemed to echo in dimensions I couldn't perceive. As the bark faded, the clinic door swung open on its own. Not blown by wind, not pushed by any visible force, just opened as if invisible hands had turned the handle. The hallway beyond was empty, but the fluorescent lights dimmed to a soft glow that felt more like candlelight than electric illumination. And in that gentle darkness, carried on air that tasted of memory and loss and hope, I heard something that made my heart stop. The sound of a child's laughter, distant but clear, filled with the kind of joy that belongs to summer afternoons and birthday parties and moments when the whole world feels safe and bright. I held Echo tighter, feeling her heartbeat synchronize with mine, and understood that our story was just beginning. Whatever had been buried behind the Meridian Mill hadn't stayed underground. It had found its way back to the surface, carried in the body of a dog who remembered being loved by a little girl named Anna, who had somehow found the strength to survive impossible things and the courage to trust again. The past wasn't finished with us yet. There would be questions that demanded answers, authorities who would want to reclaim their lost experiment, truths that would have to be faced no matter how terrible they proved to be. But in that moment, surrounded by impossible hope and the lingering echo of a child's laughter, I knew that Echo and I would face whatever came together. Because some bonds transcend death, some love survives even the most determined attempts to destroy it, and some stories refuse to end until justice has been served and the lost have finally found their way home. The technology that had created Echo was meant to be a tool of surveillance and control, but love had found a way to repurpose it, to transform a weapon into something that could heal the deepest wounds. Anna hadn't simply disappeared 10 years ago. She'd been taken, experimented on, used as a test subject for technology that treated consciousness, as just another resource to be harvested and exploited. But somehow, some fragment of her had survived, had found sanctuary in the neural pathways of her beloved companion, had waited a decade for the right moment to surface and demand justice. The laughter faded, but the warmth it carried remained, filling the clinic with the presence of love that had refused to be extinguished. Echo settled more comfortably in my lap, no longer the traumatized creature I'd pulled from that makeshift grave, but revealed as the guardian she'd always been, the keeper of secrets that could change everything if we had the courage to listen. Somewhere in the distance, engines were starting. Cars moving through the night, carrying people who would want to silence us, to reclaim their lost property and bury the truth even deeper than before. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated the power of love to transcend any boundary, to survive any attempt at destruction, to find ways to communicate across impossible distances. The real work was just beginning, but for the first time since I'd lost my sister Lucia to the same forces that had claimed Anna, I felt something that resembled hope. Justice delayed isn't justice denied, and some debts can be collected even from those who think they're beyond the reach of consequence. Echo looked up at me with eyes that held all the determination her young friend had possessed, and I knew that together we would find a way to honor the sacrifice that had brought us to this moment. The dead don't always stay silent, and the buried don't always stay underground, especially when love refuses to let them go.